So thank you everybody for joining us today. We're here to have professional wrestler Colt Cabana with us. We're very lucky and honored to have him. He's been in the professional wrestling industry for over 20 years. He's a legend on the independent circuit, and he's currently signed to All Elite Wrestling. I'm going to pass the microphone over to Jeff Bukantz, Maccabi USA President, who is going to be moderating this interview. If you have any questions for Colt, please feel free to write it into the chat box, or if we have time later on, we can open up microphones. And Jeff, thank you very much for moderating, and I'll pass it off to you.
Thanks, Steve. And especially thanks for joining us, Colt. We really appreciate it. And whether you're a hardcore wrestling fan or a casual fan, or you're just here because you're curious and you think the world of professional wrestling begins and ends with the World Wrestling Entertainment, it's not the case at all. And today we're going to hear from Colt, who's going to show that he had a great career already. He's still young, more to go. And it's a story of perseverance and overcoming obstacles in politics and developing a niche in order to succeed. So Colt, I'd like to ask you, where did you grow up and what was your Jewish upbringing like?
Hello, thanks for having me. I hope to inspire or spread some kind of whatever I'm doing here. I grew up on the mean streets of Deerfield, Illinois, the North Shore suburbs of Chicago. And the extent of my Judaism was, Deerfield's pretty, I thought as a kid, I thought Deerfield was like all Jewish people and then like one or two Christian people, or whatever in my kindergarten. Later to learn, I think it was like 50% Jewish, which made it one of the most Jewish neighborhoods, maybe even in the country, at just 50%. When later I would learn in Sunday school how little the percentage of Jewish people were in the world. But for the most part, Hanukkahs, and for me, bar mitzvah, and then the bar mitzvah scene, of course, in the North Shore, which was, everyone trying to one-up everybody. And I wasn't necessarily, and still am not necessarily, very deep in the religious aspect, but I do love the cultural almost tones that the Jews represent, and myself and the ones before me, and kind of just the I don't know, almost it's a horrible way to say it, but almost the stereotypes that like my mother is, and that I share these stories with my friends, and they have the same kind of Jewish mothers and worrying mothers and whatnot, and so I do wear that style of Judaism, as a badge of honor to this day and in the wrestling world. But typical Jewish upbringing, especially the North Shore in Chicago.
And of course, the most natural question after asking about your Jewish upbringing is, were you a pro wrestling fan as a kid?
Yeah, obsessed with pro wrestling, just totally obsessed. And recently I've befriended Barry Horowitz. And Barry Horowitz was so important to me as a wrestling fan and as a kid. And I told Barry this because before there was Goldberg for the Jewish wrestling fan, and, especially in my time, I'm a kid of the 80s. I'm 39 years old. I realized, who was it? Abe, who's the famous?
Abe Jacobs from New Zealand.
Abe Jacobs was a little before me, so I couldn't be able to relate to him. But for me, I loved wrestling. I was obsessed with pro wrestling. I watched all of it. And to me, if you were in the wrestling ring, you were a hero of mine because you got to be a wrestler and I wasn't. So I realized that Hulk Hogan, they were saying Hulk Hogan is the world's greatest wrestler, Junkyard Dog is the greatest wrestler. But even the idea, even though Barry Horowitz was presented as somebody who was constantly losing, to me, he was a megastar because he was on TV and he got to be a wrestler. So when I saw the name Barry Horowitz presented on the screen, obviously I realized from the many of Horowitzes that were in my elementary school or junior high school that, oh, this is a Jewish guy and Jewish people can be wrestlers. And that was probably one of the first things that clicked in my mind that, oh, I could be a wrestler. We can be wrestlers. It's allowed.
It's amazing you brought that up because I was going to talk about Jewish wrestlers, Abe Jacobs from New Zealand, who has a postage stamp after him. Barry Horowitz,
Mhm.
of all people, because
Mhm.
Goldberg and Horowitz were the only two wrestlers, maybe Abe Jacobs, who had an overtly Jewish name.
Right.
Scott Levy, Raven, we didn't know he was Jewish technically. The Malenkos, Simon, we didn't know they were Jewish. Mark Lewin was Jewish, but we didn't know. It's interesting, of all people, Barry Horowitz. So was Horowitz your favorite wrestler growing up?
No, I mean, the idea that Horowitz was Jewish and a wrestler was, obviously held a place in my heart. But I was fascinated with all of the wrestling. I just grew up, in Chicago. We got WWF, NWA. We would get Windy City Wrestling on Sports Channel every now and then. ESPN would play some AWA. They would play Global Wrestling Federation. They would play some old World Class. And then even toward the mid 90s, we would get syndication from Memphis and USWA. So, and there was Glow, which is the Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling. So anything I could find of wrestling, I was obsessed with. Of course, WWF with the higher production value always stood out, but any kind of wrestling, anything I liked, and all of the wrestlers. I mean, but as an 80s kid, I guess, with the cartoons and the LJN rubber dolls, Hulk Hogan, the Macho Man, and I like Mr. Perfect and, I guess the big characters and good wrestlers I really enjoyed as a kid.
So did you want to be a pro wrestler since you were a kid?
Yeah. I was obsessed with wrestling. And then when I started getting, when I would start going to Barnes and Noble, so when we would go on trips or, usually to Florida to see my grandma like everybody else, we would always get the wrestling magazines, and I would get the magazines, and I was obsessed with the magazines, anything wrestling. And then one time I saw in the magazines, there was an advertisement for it was almost like a trade newsletter. It was called the Pro Wrestling Torch. And basically the magazines at Walgreens or Jewel Osco or whatever, those were just kind of fluff pieces. But the Pro Wrestling Torch really told you the ins and outs of, it was really the internet before the internet, and they would tell you the backstory and what people got paid and how it worked. And I'm going to ask everyone to mute their microphone, Devin.
Oh, everyone mute, please.
And then so I would say I was probably 13 or 14 when I started getting those, and I started realizing that not only was I a fan, but I could be a pro wrestler, because I never thought I was good enough. I knew as just a schlubby Jewish kid from the suburbs, I wasn't going to look like Hulk Hogan or Ultimate Warrior. But when I would read the inside trade magazines, it would say hey, these guys wrestled in front of 100 people in Memphis, and these guys were in Kokomo, Indiana, in front of 125 people, and this guy got paid $20, and I was like, oh, I could do that. And so that was the realization, probably when I was around 13 or 14, that this is what I want to do for a living.
So when I was a kid, I wanted to play baseball like Mickey Mantle, or play hockey for the Rangers like Roger Bear, maybe even be like Bruno Sammartino, but I didn't do it. How on God's green earth did you get up and do it?
I mean, there's so much to that, but it was just what I wanted to do. I never thought that I could do it for a living, really. But I did know, like I said, because there was shows in front of 100, 125 people, I knew I could be like a weekend warrior. I always thought of it as I would watch my mom and dad play on a rec league softball team. And I said well, at the very least, I can do this as a weekend fun thing while, having a family or whatever it might be, doing the real job that I have to do. So I wanted to go to wrestling school. I said after high school I was going to join a wrestling school, and I didn't want to go to college. And then, of course, my parents said, you have to go to college. And so they said, listen, you can start being a wrestler once you graduate college. All we want you to do is graduate college. Once you graduate college, you can do whatever you want. But you just need that, bullshit piece of paper that says, you spent a lot of money and you're valuable to the world or whatever, right? So I went to college for 1 year to play college football. And I hated college football. And I was, after the season, I stuck out the season. I knew I wanted to quit. I knew I wanted to quit the second day of practice. But, I said, I'm going to stick this season out. I kind of don't want to, I almost feel like I don't want to be a quitter. And I think I can make it through at least one season. And so after the season, I told my parents I have to be a wrestler. And they said, okay, as long as you finish school, as long as you continue with school, you can do wrestling school if you can do both. And so that's what I did. In April of 1999, I started wrestling, and I continued my education, and I trained while going to college. And then eventually I wrestled while going to college, and all throughout my whole college time, I would, I would make sure to get classes Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And then I would travel all over the Midwest to all these different shows, making very little money, for Friday, Saturday shows, and sometimes traveling on a Thursday, or sometimes traveling on a Sunday. And I did that for many, many years, 3 straight years until I graduated college. And then I got another job as a teaching assistant out of college. And then after 2 years of being a teaching assistant, which was 5 years constantly doing shows every single Friday, Saturday, Sunday for the most part, I was able to quit my job, and I was making probably $8,500 a year as a wrestler. And I said, I can do this full time as a wrestler on $8,500.
So interesting story. I think Mick Foley talked about that also when he was in college working the weekends. It's a hard business. It's a closed business to get into. How did you find a school, and who trained you?
Yeah, there was a local school in Chicago on Six Corners in Portage Park. And, I did I looked around to a couple of people, and, I was going to school in Kalamazoo at Western Michigan University at the time. Dan Severn, who was a UFC legend, he was doing some wrestling training. And actually there was a guy named Mike Shaw who wrestled as Bastion Booger in the WWF, and he was doing some wrestling training. But I found a real good fit with the guys in Chicago, 2 guys named Danny Dominion and Ace Steele. At the time they were, I was 18 years old. At the time they were 25, and they were in good shape, and they looked like wrestlers, and they were on the hustle to try to be wrestlers themselves, which I liked more because I felt Dan Severn and Bastion Booger were just kind of old, and you hear those horror stories of them, people just taking your money. And so I thought these guys who looked the part and were pretty close to making a break for themselves, I thought that would be the better fit for me. Also to get kind of mentorship that I felt I really wanted and needed. And I thought these guys would make for better mentors than someone who was maybe a little placed out of my age range at that time. And I was correct. They became great mentors and good friends and great trainers.
So did you encounter any anti-Semitism in the business?
Yeah. So the first, it's kind of interesting. And I guess we all have the story, and I'd assume a lot of us know this in some kind of way, is, going into professional wrestling, I kept my Judaism quiet at first. Going into training, I was just, to train to be a wrestler, I kept my mouth shut, my ears open. And my trainers later told me that, because I'm kind of a boisterous person, they thought I was so shy at first, but I'm not shy, but I wanted to learn, and I wanted to understand. And I knew me being a big mouth wasn't going to get anywhere. I needed to take in this information. I didn't need to tell them information because I didn't know anything. They knew everything. They were teaching me. So I thought that was a big part of my learning. And in saying that, I wasn't very boisterous. So from the beginning in the training, there was a couple, Jewish jabs, making fun of the stereotypes and whatever, not knowing I was Jewish. And then as I became more comfortable, it kind of came out, and they were like, why didn't you tell us? They were like, we don't care. And I was like, you say to yourself, we don't care, but you hear the things and you're like, well, obviously, that's in the back of people's minds. So that was kind of the first one. When I went to England I went to England to live for 3 months after I quit my full-time job as a teaching assistant. I went to England because there was an opportunity to wrestle every single day. And it was very scary. I went to England to live for 3 months, and I brought $60 cash, which I later learned was a very dumb move, but I didn't know any better. And one of the guys in the car told me he never met a 4x2 that he ever liked. And I didn't know what that was, but there's a thing called Cockney rhyming slang. And so 4x2 is a rhyme for Jew. So that's, that was something I had never heard. And then right away, that just came up in conversation. I didn't say I was Jewish. A lot of people think I'm Italian, I think. So the first day, you know, I'm just like, well, I'm not going to go fucking say to everyone how Jewish I am, because obviously there seems to be a lot of hate right off the bat. And then, you know, a lot of those people became my friends. And, you know, later learned, I think, you know, I was 24 at that time. And I think I was probably when I came back from that trip is when I really started to kind of like, because I became really confident in myself as a wrestler and as a person, and my status in professional wrestling. So when my status was low in wrestling, I wasn't very, I wouldn't yell to the world about my Judaism almost out of fear. But when my status got a little higher, I would wear it like a badge of honor, being like, I'm Jewish. And then people who had something to say about Jews or about Judaism, they almost felt like, you know, if they would attack, they would be attacking the hierarchy of professional wrestling, and that could hurt them politically, right? So I felt that power as a wrestler in my late 20s helped kind of attack any kind of anti-Semitism right on. And then I did tell, I've told this story. I don't name names, and this person still is in the wrestling industry. But when I was in the WWE system, their developmental system, one of the trainers would refer to me in front of everyone as Colt Cabana. And you know, as a comedian myself, it didn't like, I mean, it hurt my heart a little bit, but it hurt my heart because I thought how sad this person was, that they're so ignorant not to know that that's not the right thing to say, not the right thing to say in that kind of structure. Why would you say that? You know, how much that hurt, how stupid you look in front of everybody else. So, you know, I obviously a little bit of like, what the name, you know, what that name means, you know, from our past, but you know, it didn't shoot through my heart in that sense, but I just really felt bad for that person, and still do. And I think I wouldn't say less of them. I think nothing of that, of him.
Horrible. And you're not in a position to say anything or go above his head, right?
So at that point, you know, all I wanted to do, was tell somebody, but the WWE is known to have this crazy political structure, and I thought, and I think times have changed, but I thought if I said something, that person would be yelled at, and then I would still be working under them, and then they would make my life a living hell. So I decided not to say anything.
Oh my God. Well, you talked about wearing the badge of honor at some point, but you also wore the badge on your uniform. Now you have the boom, boom, you know, colorful trunks, but you used to have the Star of David on your trunks, if I remember.
See, a lot of people mistake that for it. It was the Chicago Star, the 6-pointed star.
Oh, is that true?
Yes, that is true. But you know, one of my best-selling T-shirt ever is the I Love Colt, which is the I Star of David Colt.
All right, got that one wrong.
I've sold those for years, and if anyone's interested, Pro Wrestling Tees /Colt Cabana.
Wow. So let's go from that sort of uncomfortable topic. Let's talk about something more pleasant, like how you developed your character. For those of you that don't know, Colt is a very fan-friendly babyface. When he comes in, the people chant his name. He's very likable, but you developed a certain style. And tell us how you started that.
Yeah, sure. I do a comedic style of professional wrestling. You know, I call it comedy wrestling. And essentially, when you think of pro wrestling, you think of the really tough guys who want to beat each other up. And that's how they win their matches. But the way I have my style of wrestling is I use humor, and I almost use comedy to throw my opponent off balance. And that's kind of how I win my matches. So it's not necessarily beating the crap out of somebody, but it's kind of using my wit to throw them off. And that's how I win. Now, of course, you know, wrestling is scripted. So the fun part of that is like almost like a stand-up comedian, is I have my little bits that I use, and like and I've developed them over so many years that I put them in play. But also the thing is, the difference between stand-up and pro wrestling is a stand-up can, I feel, well, I don't know, it's different because I'm on television now, but a stand-up could have taken those jokes to all, it wasn't filmed, it was taken to all the different clubs around the country. But once you get it on TV, you can't kind of use it. Once you use a joke, you can't continually use those jokes. You have to come up with new jokes. So I kind of had to do the same thing, whereas I was wrestling in the same circle, I couldn't necessarily do the same wrestling jokes over and over again. So a lot about it is developing new jokes and new ways to play with the crowd. I love improv. I'm a huge improviser when it comes to wrestling. So and that's what keeps my matches fresh a lot, especially when you come see me live, is I'm always playing with the crowd. I'm playing with the ref. I'm playing with my opponent. And a lot of that is just doing it on the fly. And so that's kind of like coming with the chops of wrestling everywhere. I've wrestled probably over 3,000 matches. And I do that because, when I tell young wrestlers, they're like, how do I get there? How do I do this? I always say like reps. It's like batting practice. You can't just go up and hit a home run. Like you gotta wrestle as much as humanly possible. So you get to the point where if a situation comes, you're ready for it. You can't just get in the gym, get a tan, and then you'll be ready for TV. You need those 10,000 hours. And same with wrestling. So I've developed this over a long, long time. I've been wrestling, like you said, I've been wrestling over 20 years now. So
can you tell us, I know you've been all around the world. Tell us the countries you've been to. And then when you tell us that, I'd like to know about the different styles and how the different fans react in these different countries.
It's a long list. I've done probably 20 tours of Japan. I've probably done over 70 tours of the UK. I've been to Australia 5 times. I've been to China. I've been to Hong Kong. I've been to Mexico. I've been to Puerto Rico. I've been to Russia. I've been to Austria. I've been to Germany. I've been to India. And I've been to South America. I've been to Chile. I've toured Peru, Costa Rica. So I've really been very fortunate. And you have to remember that. And if you want to talk about it, I was in WWE for 7 matches, and so that's usually when people are, people get to tour as a pro wrestler when they were a big name in WWF or WWE, and then these people take them all over the world. So I got to these places by just kind of like making a niche for myself on the underground scene so much that I was able to travel the world on somebody else's dime. And so, wrestling is kind of, what's great about wrestling is the language is spoken through physicality. So I'm able to wrestle in Hong Kong, and I'm able to wrestle in Japan, and I'm able to be successful because of my pro wrestling. I can't speak any of those languages. But they vary they vary, but the reality is if you can entertain and you understand the aspect of fan manipulation, which is what it is. There's a lot of psychology that goes into professional wrestling, and if you can understand that psychology, then you can do it to any crowd, no matter what language they speak. So obviously, when I wrestled on a dirt patch in India for 4 straight days, it was a little harder than like the rowdy crowd of Philadelphia, who are just ready to do anything. But let's say in India, where they had never seen. Not only have they never seen live wrestling, they never saw a white person, I don't think, in this town that I wrestled in. You slowly teach them how wrestling works through your physicality. So I could do a lot of in Philadelphia, I do a lot of the tropes of pro wrestling. Everybody understands, but in India, you teach them why a headlock hurts. So you put on a headlock and you make the face, and then they realize like, oh, that hurts. And then when you escape it, they realize, you're really breaking down the simplicity of pro wrestling in a place like India, or a place, like the border towns in Mexico or whatever, as opposed to, Chicago or New York or even Tokyo.
Were you ever in front of any fans that were just rabid and crazier than others?
Yeah. Glasgow has an amazing scene. And then I wrestled for the Insane Clown Posse, who is a legendary rap group who was recently, they were, wrongly filed as a gang under the FBI. I'm a big fan and a big supporter of ICP, but obviously, the Juggalos have a reputation, and so that reputation is correct when it comes to big wrestling fans. And so I was the bad guy for their promotion, and I still am. I wrestle as a policeman, which of course. I'm a policeman And then the guy I wrestle is a weed dealer. And in the world of the Insane Clown Posse at the Gathering of the Juggalos, the weed dealer is the good guy. The policeman is obviously the bad guy. And so I was the most hated in that group. And then with that, came, throwing stuff and throwing beer and cups of piss, a couple of times I remember. But, weirdly, I look at it like a badge of honor. Like, you hear the stories of people getting like pennies thrown at them in Puerto Rico in the old days. And so I think to me, it's kind of romantic. It's like I'm wrestling in those times.
So you've held a lot of championships, and winning the championship means that a promoter trusts you, that you can do a good job and draw fans and they respect you. So what are the biggest championships that you've held that you're most proud of?
Yeah, I've won a lot of belts, and it's really cool. And it's a symbol, like, it's a lot of it's, predetermined or whatnot, but it's a symbolization of like, you're the leader of this gang or of this group. So I was a 2-time Ring of Honor World Tag Team Champion. I was the NWA World's Heavyweight Champion 2 times, and I defended that all over America. I wrestled with it in Japan and Australia and Canada and Mexico. And I was recently the NWA National Heavyweight Champion. And please don't forget about the Insane Clown Posse's Juggalo Championship Wrestling Heavyweight Champion. And
what about the Jewish North American Champion?
Yes. And I did win, I think it's called the Mitzvah Championship on the title. The North American Jewish Championship in a backyard in Toronto in front of 400 Orthodox Jews. The Megan twins up there in Toronto, they're 2 brothers who kind of run the bar mitzvah entertainment scene up there and have been for years. They put on these, bigger than big, and they are 2 huge wrestling fans. They are the nephews of the Iron Sheik. We're not sure if they really are or not, but they've taken the Iron Sheik in, and they've known him since they were kids. And so not only do they run a lot of wrestling shows, they run a lot of charity wrestling shows. Oh wait, hold on. There's 2. I've won 2. Sorry. This is the Megan twins. And in Toronto they run coincide with a lot of with Jewish organizations, but also in Minnesota, Rabbi Fine just recently started running in collaboration with a promotion named First Wrestling. And Rabbi Jeremy Fine, who's living in Minnesota, he started a deal at his synagogue where he's running shows, and I won that championship also. So I have 2 Jewish championships under my.
Now that's impressive. And for those of you that don't know, the NWA, the National Wrestling Alliance, was the biggest organizer of wrestling long before the WWE. Such people as Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, Ric Flair, Harley Race, the Briscoes, the Funks, whatever. I mean, that is, when you look at lineage, I would have to say that's a pretty cool thing, right?
Yeah, very, very much so. And again, like I said, like my love of the past and the history of pro wrestling, so I do romanticize it a little bit. So to be in that group, in that category forever is such an achievement, and I don't think about it lightly.
Well, that's a real mazel tov. And one of those champions was Dusty Rhodes, the American Dream, who was known for the bionic elbow. Yeah. And I noticed that you've incorporated that into your moveset.
Yeah, for me, when I started studying the wrestlers, as I became a wrestler, the ones that were kind of a little jazzy and a little, full of charisma are the ones that I really started to kind of attach myself to. Junkyard Dog, Jimmy the Boogie Woogie Man, Dusty Rhodes, Terry Funk. It's a kind of a long list of people that I really started to enjoy and kind of incorporate a lot of their mannerisms or stuff. And again, I didn't necessarily steal. I just became inspired by it. And that's something I tell a lot of young wrestlers is don't see something and just straight up steal what people do. Become inspired by them and let that inspire you into something that you want to be, and something, you want to be your own person. You don't want to be a second somebody else.
Well, I think in all my years of watching wrestling, I've seen lots of finishing moves, and usually it's a backbreaker or something where the guy is destroyed 1, 2, 3. You came up with a move I had never seen before that's really cool called the Superman. Tell us how you came up with that.
Yeah, it's an old. So I also became obsessed when I moved to England in 2004 for the 3 months. I became obsessed with 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s professional wrestling from the UK, which was on a television channel. It was on ITV and it was called World of Sport. And if you go on YouTube, so I'll give a recommendation. My favorite wrestler is a guy named Les Kellett, LESKELLETT, and he's a 1970s wrestler, and he's just comedy, just does comedy, and it's way before its time, and he's unlike anybody else. And that World of Sport wrestling was completely different from every style of wrestling, Japan, American, Mexico. And there was a wrestler named Ken Joyce who would use that as a pin. Essentially, the person is on their back with their legs up, and then I dive through and I fold them over like a table. And that's something I've implemented. And again, in wrestling, what's old is new. And, nobody's watching 1960s wrestling like I am in the UK. So I can bring that. So I'm able to bring that to TNT every Wednesday night on a national platform. And everyone thinks I invented some kind of new move, but it's just it's a callback and an homage to a wrestler named Ken Joyce.
Well, it fits your character perfectly because you're a feel-good, smiling at the fans guy, and that's a feel-good finisher. I mean, it's really, it's pretty cool. I wanted to ask you, I looked in doing some research for this. I hadn't realized that you've wrestled everybody. So can you tell us what are some of the best matches or greatest moments that you've had?
I mean, I really have. I've wrestled so many wrestlers. So in being obsessed with World of Sport Wrestling, there was a wrestler named Johnny Saint, and I'd recommend Googling or YouTubing Johnny Saint. He's unlike any other wrestler. His title would be an escapologist, which means he was an escape artist, which means if you put him in any hold, he knew how to escape in the most eloquent of manners. It's really, it's more, please watch, his name is Johnny Saint. He's more of an artist than he is a professional wrestler at the time. And I was able to wrestle him in Sheffield, England in front of about 1,000 people, and he was 67 years old at the time. And I'll forever cherish that moment. Another one, when I came back from the WWE, I came back to Ring of Honor, and I was a surprise partner for Bryan Danielson, who now wrestles as Daniel Bryan in the WWE. And this was at the Hammerstein Ballroom, which holds about 2,500 people in downtown New York. And then I was a surprise. So when my music played, the building literally, not literally, but almost erupted. And you see me sliding in, I start punching people, and then I go to the second rope to kind of get my rah-rah. And, I had so many emotions at that time for me coming back to this place that I had wrestled before. And then the fans like still remembering me, and you can see my legs, they're like shaking. And so that match will always have a place in my heart. Some of the matches that I wrestled in Japan, I'll forever be grateful for. Even recently, I formed a tag team with a guy named Toru Yano, who is the comedian wrestler of Japan. And I started wrestling for a company called New Japan in Tokyo and all around Japan. And they're essentially the WWE of Japan. And so for me, after, at that point, it was like 19 years or 20 years as a wrestler, to make it to this place in Japan, and then tag with a guy who was very similar. And me and Yano had some of the most fun matches that I've ever participated in. And then I don't know, there's so many. I've had so many great matches, from the series of matches for the NWA title with Adam Pearce, even to my debut in the WWE against Brian Kendrick, although, I lost and it was pretty quick. At that point in my career, it symbolized, 10 years of hard work to be able to make it to this kind of stage under a contract, and for them to debut me and be like, hey, I always tell people, there's more NFL players than there are WWE wrestlers. So it's just the odds of making the WWE are so they're almost sad. And then again, like I said, a schlubby kid from the suburbs to become a WWE superstar at that point, although it wasn't the most successful career choice at that time, it did have some kind of symbolism, and it was kind of a benchmark for my career and my life at that time.
So the WWE thing didn't work out. I heard on one of your podcasts something with Impact didn't work out with Jim Cornette or whatever it was.
Vince
Russo. And that because he doesn't like comedy. Everything with him is 1970s realism. No?
Cornette wasn't there. No, Vince Russo. And then Vince Russo later tried to apologize to me because the guy who recommended me, he didn't like the guy who recommended me. So he wouldn't even bother to even look at me. And during that match, and I put that, not that anyone will pay for, but I put that match on my Patreon, and like it was me versus a guy named TJ Perkins, and the crowd was going crazy for me. And he's just like, what am I going to do with this guy? Was his answer. So yeah, I wasn't asked to come with Impact either.
So after 20 years of going around the world and developing your niche, all of a sudden, All Elite Wrestling, a new group it's on every Wednesday night, you got hired. Last week, you were in a feature match at a very important time slot in front of almost 700,000 people. That must have been quite a great feeling, right?
Yeah. You know, I debuted with, you know, it's a little weird because of the situation, obviously, with everything going on. But when I debuted, it was where was it? It was a 4-on-4 match, and I was heavily in the match. That was my debut, and that was in front of 5,000 people at the time. It was kind of before all this stuff went down. I think that was the real kind of key moment. Whereas, you know, Jim Ross was talking about me playing football. That was the reason I played college football, was because Jim Ross liked how people played college football. To all the love I got on the internet, to the crowd like cheering my name. And so that was a real vindication. And so, yeah, last week, you know, being on with Lance Archer was great. But I think the start of all of it, and the crowd knowing and loving me, and wanting, you know, rooting for me. And that's been my thing this whole time. You know, I always look at it, my career as this post and pre-WWE careers that I had. And, you know, post WWE, when, you know, I thought I got a kind of a bad rap, you know, my whole thing was like, you know, I want to make myself vulnerable. I want to put myself out there. I want people to cheer for me, the person, you know, not necessarily the wrestler. And I think that and this, and it's going on right now, is, you know, people cheering for me to get this big break in pro wrestling after 21 years.
And Steve, can you put up that video of Colt's debut? Can you put it up for everybody?
Yeah.
That was a moment that, you know, I got excited too as a fan of his also. It was really just a great feel-good moment.
I hope this is the right video. I have the one from Revolution. Is that the right one?
No, I don't know. Let's see.
Well, that was my debut.
Yeah, that's watching.
This is your in-ring debut.
No, that was my debut, not the in-ring, but still, this is amazing too. Yeah.
You got sound?
I don't got
sound.
Sound should be on.
There's no sound, but I look pretty.
Yeah, that was good. Thank you, Steve. So, I mean, would you say, Colt, that of all the moments that you've had, that's got to be right there, right?
It's up there, of course. Yeah.
That was a good one. So developing a niche, like other than wrestling, you know, right now we're in a stage where we're doing this because we're trying to get content for our community. Everyone's doing that now. And when I listened to one of your podcasts, you said you were trying to do that too, for the guy driving home, something to listen to. And right now, everyone's got a podcast. But when you started it 10 years ago, nobody had a podcast. How did you even think to go down that route?
Well, people did, you know, percentage-wise, nobody had a podcast, but deaf people had podcasts. And so that is what inspired me. So, you know, again, so I got fired from the WWE, and I wanted to be a pro wrestler for a living. And I said to myself, well, okay, wrestling shows only happen Friday and Saturday. But I want to, you know, I don't want to be the lazy guy who just sits home Monday and Thursday and waits for something to come to me. I want to bring wrestling, you know, to people, or I want people to be able to absorb wrestling, not just at my shows. And so I had to think, like, how do we bring wrestling to the world without the wrestling ring? And that's kind of, that's how I've developed myself for the past over 10 years, is what can I do with wrestling that isn't necessarily the act of professional wrestling? And so with that came YouTube shows, with that came documentaries, with that came comedy and comedy shows. And then most importantly, you know, for me came the podcast, and that was just one of many things. That's just the thing that kind of blew up, though, So at the time, comedians, I was listening to a lot of comedy podcasts. I'm a huge fan of comedy, and comedians in the industry were talking to other comedians, and that's what I found insightful. I love that inside talking shop kind of thing that was going on. And, wrestling fans had wrestling podcasts, but nobody inside the wrestling industry was talking the wrestling industry with other wrestlers or wrestling personalities. And I said to myself, I can't wait for that to happen for the wrestling industry. And then after about 6 months, I was like, oh, no one's going to do this. I should start it. So I asked some friends with some help. And, at first, the technicalities and the audio wasn't the best, but I essentially taught myself everything to learn how to do it by myself, because I didn't want to have to depend on anybody, and no one was going to think it was as important that, no one thinks anything is as important as you do, your own thing. So sometimes we think like, the thing we are doing is the most important thing, and we assume that everybody else is, but please understand that it's not that important to everybody else. It's just a blip on a thing, and it's a thing they enjoy. And that's how I look at my podcast. It's like, this is just a thing they enjoy, and I want to give it to somebody every week so they can enjoy themselves, for a car ride. I think it's the most important thing, and it is to me, but, not necessarily anyone else. It's just a thing they enjoy. So I wanted to give somebody a thing they enjoy. I wanted to learn how to do every aspect of it, so I didn't have to count on anybody else. And, for basically 8 straight years, I talked to somebody in person. It was never on Skype or anything. It was in person in locker rooms all around the world. And we talked about our trials and tribulations of life on the road, and how we got to where we wanted to get. Much like you're hearing kind of my story. This kind of stuff was never talked about 10 years ago, and so I kind of opened that up for the wrestling communities to hear the real stories of people's lives and journeys. And now it's kind of the podcast itself has slowed down a little bit, and I do it in batches now, but I still do it. And I still love doing it. And I still love talking to the wrestlers. Because like you said, everyone has a podcast. So now basically I did what I did for about 5 years, and then Stone Cold Steve Austin started doing the same thing. And then, once the greatest wrestler of your generation starts doing something, you're not as cool as that person doing it. So, and then once Steve Austin was doing it, everyone else was like, oh, this is a thing we can do. So the market did get very much flooded, but luckily, I was doing it for so long. We talk about niches. I have, I gained so many wonderful people that started from the beginning with me and followed my story, and they're attached to me and my story. So, they still go out and listen to these other shows, but, luckily I have a core group of people who still want to hear my stories, and you still want to hear me talk to other wrestlers.
How many podcasts have you done?
It's got to be over 500 now, I think. Yeah, something like that. I think I'm at like 385 in talks, and then I changed it for a while to doing a road series, and then, I've done I did like a documentary style for a year and a half. So it's somewhere near 500.
And I saw the hits on some of these were in the hundreds of thousands. I mean, some of them were way up there, right?
Yeah. I've had millions and upon millions of downloads.
So you talked about life on the road. Tell us a little bit about life on, what is it like as a weekend warrior initially, and then doing it full time?
Yeah, well, I mean, not now it's kind of weird, but until March 1st, I've done about 1.5 million miles on, in the air. I've probably done, nothing similar to that, but on the road. And so I've just found, what works for me. And, I have a routine that I use, and every week I jump on, the train, and I go to the airport, and, luckily now, with Ring of Honor and AEW, they'll pay for my Uber. So that's a little nicer. But I've accustomed my lifestyle to what it is. And this is something I've always wanted to do. I've made a lot of sacrifices when it comes to people and priorities and relationships, but I've made sure to kind of maintain everything I can. And whenever it gets hard, I always just say to myself, I could be doing something I don't want to do. This is my dream. I've always wanted to do this. And I try to always put it in perspective and kind of jump back in reality to not how lucky I am, but how this is the only thing I've ever wanted to do, and I'm doing this. So believe me, it's not that bad.
So you are a wrestler who thrives on interaction with the fans.
Yeah.
I've never seen anything like it. They love you, and there's someone that you want to root for this guy. He's lovable and likable. And now you're doing these empty arena matches where there are no fans.
Right.
And I saw in one of the matches, you started the rhythmic clapping. You looked around, there's no one to clap back. How do you deal with the empty arena?
Well, that's how I deal with it. I think to myself, what are the jokes I can make? You know, what are the tropes? The tropes are we clap to get the fans going, and there are no fans. And I feel maybe a lot of wrestlers will just wrestle like they would, but I want to acknowledge what's happening. You know, that's kind of how that's where my comedy comes from, is acknowledging the realities of the situation. So, you know, on TV, it's a little different because it's on TV, but you know, if I'm at a small show, like, you know, I'm acknowledging all the little nuances that are happening in the arena and the crowd and the different fans. For a while, one of the things I loved doing was, if someone was on their cell phone during the match, I would roll out of the ring and take their phone while they were texting during the match. And I would take the phone away and give it to the ref, and I'd tell them they could have their phone back after the match. And that was always something that made me laugh. So, but those are the little things. So you just kind of look to see what's around in your surroundings, and then you play off of that. And so that's kind of what's happening now with these matches with no arena is, you know, I look around my surroundings, it's something new. And then I say to myself, you know, how can I make myself different? How can I stand out?
Have you had any bad injuries?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, you know, both AC joints in my shoulder, a couple, blown out, quads, what are they called? Hematoma, something like that.
Hematoma manium.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you know, nothing that's like stopped me. Recently, I got an MRI for my shoulder, and I found out that I had a 50% rotator cuff tear and 100% labrum tear, and I thought my career almost would be over. And I just, what I've learned is that I've just been working through pain my whole career. Is that when I showed the MRI to my physical therapist, she was like, I didn't even think you'd be able to lift your arm. And I was like, oh, I have full mobility. It's not even that big of a deal. And what happens is essentially is, you know, when my labrum got to 99%, I still wrestled. When I got to 98, and I adjusted. And so I just adjusted down to, you know, 0% labrum to where my body, and that's where a lot of people and doctors have told me, is that the body is just such a unbelievable thing, is that, you know, a normal person working a desk job maybe wouldn't have been able to adjust to it, but my body has just adjusted to it gradually over the time. And I've seen many doctors and specialists about it, and they're, you know, they're like, you can continue wrestling, just keep on doing your rehab. And, you know, I just have a lot of different things that I do. And so it's weird. My shoulder feels, you know, there's a little less strength in my shoulder, but it feels better than ever. And at one point, you know, 2 years ago, I thought maybe I only had a couple years left in me, and now I feel I can do it another 10 easily with the shoulder.
Are there other sports that you play or that you like?
You know, in high school, I was a little jock boy. I played, like I said, I played a year of college football. I played basketball my freshman, sophomore year. I played baseball freshman, sophomore year. I played hockey as a kid. I love sports, and I played sports all the time. But when I got into wrestling, I kind of just, my focus went purely on wrestling. And even so much, a couple of years ago, I was playing the Turkey Bowl during Thanksgiving with my friends from high school. And I like tore my hamstring a little bit. And I was like, this is my career. I can't afford to start tearing hamstrings as, you know, playing casual tag football on Thanksgiving. So I've kind of put all of the sports aside a little bit.
So you've accomplished so much, and now you're in this big national organization. Finally, congratulations.
Thank you.
It's really awesome. I remember looking at one of the YouTube things on the side. Someone said it's really nice to see Colt Cabana on national TV, because, you know, a lot of people feel that way. You know that, right?
Well, yes, I do, and it's appreciated.
So what else do you feel like you have to accomplish in your profession?
Well, it's kind of funny that we're on this talk. I have never been to Israel. Even in my birthright, I remember trying to convince Birthright to fly me out and let me wrestle on a show and then not do the whole birthright. That wouldn't fly. I think Rabbi Fine is working on that and bringing my championship to Israel. But it's something I would love to be able to wrestle in Israel. Because just I think I brought some kind of like the recognition of me as a Jewish wrestler coming, having some kind of fame and whatever fame it is, and then being able to go and see Israel, the Holy Land, because I was a pro wrestler. That's kind of what, as opposed to just going out like everybody else. The idea that like because I'm a pro wrestler, I get to go out and I get to see Israel, and I think also as an adult I appreciate. I think I would appreciate a lot more the history as opposed to, I know when I was younger, like it didn't really interest me. I was so focused on wrestling and just on stuff I liked. And then as I become older, I think history is something I've really learned to appreciate. So I think it would suit me better almost to come to Israel, in my late 30s, early 40s, as opposed to in my, teen years where I would probably just be there just, for the good times. Whereas, like when I travel, I enjoy going to museums. I enjoy seeing the different things that towns have to, that they're known for. So that would be a cool thing for me. Then otherwise than that, comedy and wrestling, that merged together is one of my favorites. So I would love to be able to bring that to almost to a TV show in a different way. I think that's something I would like to do. Not necessarily a wrestling show that has comedy, but almost a comedy show that has a little wrestling. That I've been close with a couple of friends over the years, kind of doing that kind of stuff. So that'd be another goal of mine.
So do you know what we do at Maccabi USA? You know about the World Maccabi Games?
Of course.
It's the third largest sporting event in the world after the Olympics and the World University Games. And when I first started going in 1981, I was really only concerned about like you having a good time, winning medals, whatever. And then I learned there was so much more. And like what we are sort of is a combination of the Jewish Olympics and Birthright, because we expose Jewish athletes of all ages to their heritage. So it's funny that you brought that up, because that's exactly what we do. We could have a good match down the road, I think, with you. I think it would be a good match. So
that'd be amazing.
So Steve, are there any questions in the queue that you want to ask for Colt?
We have two questions so far. So the first question is, what are some of your favorite either professional wrestler signature moves or their actual finishers?
I was a sucker for the high flying. I wanted to be a high flyer getting into wrestling. I just wasn't capable of doing that. Comedy was more my niche. So I was just always in awe of the luchadors who could do the high flying. There's a wrestler named Colt Scorpio who I just think the world of. He could do so many different flips and different things. And then luckily I've been in the era of my friends have been people that have invented aerial moves that nobody else has ever done, which is so cool. Guys like Ricochet, who are on WWE television now, started doing a double flip, or Will Ospreay has done some unbelievable aerial stuff. My old roommate, Evan Bourne, who is half Jewish, he was doing a shooting star on WWE television before anybody else and inventing a lot of stuff. So, these are my kind of friends who are doing this stuff. And I'm always a sucker for high flying stuff just because I can't do it. And so those are a lot of the finishing moves. I love a good moonsault. I love a good shooting star or a 450 splash. Those are kind of my favorites.
Well, you do the cartwheel.
Yeah, I can do a cartwheel. And I have a nice moonsault, actually, from years of practicing on my parents' bed, actually.
I have a question. So you talked about your time with the ICP and in JCW. Have you ever competed at the gathering?
Yeah, I've wrestled at 7 gatherings of the Juggalos. Yeah.
Cool. Can you elaborate on what that was like?
Yeah, it's, it's funny. I was talking to my friend about this just the other day. Is a lot of people get this idea of it's a scary place to be, but essentially, and if you don't know, Google the Insane Clown Posse and the Gathering of the Juggalos. But, maybe much like, in a way, the Jewish people, Juggalos and fans of the Insane Clown Posse were essentially just made fun of their whole life and looked down upon. And so this is a place where they all come to support each other. So when I go there as maybe an outsider, and if anyone goes to the Gathering of the Juggalos as an outsider, they are never shunned because they know what it's like to be shunned. So they always embrace and bring people into their community, and they call it family. That's a big thing with the Insane Clown Posse. So anyone who goes to the Gathering of Juggalos, it is never a scary thing. It's just totally embracing, just with a different sect of people. And yeah, they're a little out there, they're a little weird, but that's what makes, the Juggalos so great. And so it's never scary for me. It's always very embracive. And it's kind of cool because where else are you gonna, see Vanilla Ice doing the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles rap at 2 a.m. in a tent? Ron Jeremy walking around, Gallagher, walking around, Ice Cube, Busta Rhymes just on stage rapping. So it's such a mishmash and hodgepodge of really culture. And of course, and then I do the wrestling there, and usually the wrestling is at 3 a.m. in the morning, and I live for random, weird, fringe opportunities. So a lot of people, they want their order. I want it weird. I want it different. I want it obscure. I live for living in those kind of moments and getting to be in those moments, especially being a kid from the suburbs, living in an easy, nice, safe, growing up neighborhood. To be able to experience everything I can experience, I get a kick out of it. And, not to be within, like, not to have like a safe group, almost just be thrown into the wild. I live for it. So I love doing the Gathering of the Juggalos.
So someone had a question. What would you see the biggest difference between WWE and AEW in terms of style or,
Yeah. Well, I was there at different times, but AEW was started basically on the friendship of, Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks and Cody and Hangman Page. And then, Tony Khan, whose father owns the Jacksonville Jaguars essentially, and is this wonderful businessman. He owns a football team in the UK, and he works for the Jaguars. And it was started on like positivity and friendship. And so I think that's the difference. Whereas WWF and WWE is such a corporate structure at this point. And everyone is in very much fear of Vince McMahon, who is the almighty, where I feel that AEW is all about positivity. And there really isn't much fear. There isn't from me. Maybe there are some people on the lower level, but I don't really think so. And I think everyone at this point who is in AEW has gone through a place in their career where they were afraid, or there were people yelling at them and they didn't like it. And they knew they thrived on positivity. And I think it's so important to move forward on positivity. And so that's kind of, AEW seems to be built on positivity as opposed to scare tactics.
Which is what WWE. You have any Vince McMahon stories?
I met with Vince McMahon, and so when I wrestled with WWE, I wrestled as Scotty Goldman because Vince McMahon asked if I was really Jewish, and they said yeah, and said okay, we'll call him Goldman. So when I had a meeting with Vince McMahon to kind of like let him know who I was, and he was very, he was nice and stoic, and he's got so much business to go, that he's doing. But I remember he asked me, he goes, "Are you really Jewish?" And I go, "Well, I mean, I'm not like," what did I say? I go, I think I'm not like, I said like I'm not like a full Jew, or I'm not like crazy Jew, or I'm not like a mega Jew, and then he went, "Huh." And so that made him laugh a little bit. But I did tell him that I have my beliefs and my culture, and I love the Jewish people, and my parents are Jewish, and I'm one of them, and so that made him laugh. And then he stuck me with Scotty Goldman, and my music was basically bar mitzvah music, and instead of the bat flashing, it was the Jewish star. And then I lost 4 matches, and then I got fired. So,
how did you come up with? Well, Colt, we know because of your last name, but Cabana, where did that come from?
I think subliminally with Colt Cabana, it was just kind of, it flowed, and it just kind of, I tried a lot. I was bouncing that Colt something off of a lot of people, and Colt Cabana is the one that seemed to stick. Everyone went, "Oh, that sounds good."
So
someone did ask, who are your most, who are you looking to facing most in AEW? And is there any chance of you facing in the near future another, Jewish wrestler who is one of their hottest heels in MJF?
Yeah, Kenny Omega is somebody who I've wanted to wrestle forever. I think we're very akin to each other in terms of weirdness and comedy. So, and then luckily enough for me, we've kind of started this feud on this YouTube show called Being the Elite. So I think that match will eventually happen, and I'm very happy about that. And then of course, MJF. If you go back on YouTube and you look up a couple clips, I posted up a thing on YouTube called the Origin Story, where it turns out I am MJF's father. In the world of professional wrestling. So I think eventually MJF and myself will be doing something.
I saw that.
Yeah, a lot of people seem to, when he started wrestling and no one knew who he was, a lot of people seemed to think that we looked alike. And so then we started kind of using that in our favor and doing some storylines on local shows and stuff.
Yeah. So I think pretty much, Colt, that was it. It's an hour. I really appreciate your time. We all appreciate your time. As a longtime wrestling fan, I just want to say, I'm really so happy. Everyone's so happy for you and wish you a lot of luck. And the Maccabi games in 2 years, you never know. You never know.
Yeah, it would be an honor. I would love it. It'd be so cool. I do appreciate you guys listening, and anyone in the future who listens to this. If you're unfamiliar, my social medias are at Colt Cabana. My website's coltcabana.com. And if you want to support a young Jewish entrepreneur, I ship everything out of my apartment here. I've got everything over there. Coltmerch.com is where you can buy some goodies for the eight crazy nights. If some good, good little gifts. I got like little figures and autographs and stuff like that.
Oh, that's cool. Thanks again, Cole. Really, really appreciate it. Hope to cross paths someday. Thanks again.
Well, thank you everybody for listening.
Thank you.
And I appreciate it.
Thank you,
Bye-bye,
Colt.
everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.